Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I am your host, Kishore Volodi. And today we have a really special topic, one that we've never addressed really on the podcast before, but it's a topic that I think a lot of families may not know what kind of options are out there for their children as they become adults. What kind of options are there now that weren't there before, specifically as we talk about college options. And so I have with me on the podcast, Tom Sannicandro, who I will have you, Tom, introduce yourself. I hope that you're okay. I'm going to call you Tom during the podcast. It's a whole lot easier than your last name. And you can call me Kishore. That's fine. But what I'd love to do first, before we get into this really important topic, is if you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you love working with people with Down syndrome.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yes.
First off, I'm the dad of an adult son who's now 37 who has Down syndrome. So that's what makes me an expert in Down syndrome, because I've been doing this for a long time. I'm also a lawyer, and I've done disability law, estate planning, and special education law for about a little more than 20 years at this point. I was also in the Massachusetts legislature for 12 years. And that's where we actually began this college program here for adults with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. And it was the first publicly funded model in the country. So we're really excited. I was really excited by that. I've also been the director of the Research Institute at University of Massachusetts, which houses the National Coordinating Center. And that's the National Coordinating Center for all the post-secondary programs for people with developmental or intellectual disabilities. I also have a PhD from Brandeis, specializing in intellectual disabilities. And my dissertation was actually on outcomes for individuals with intellectual disabilities who had some college. What did it look like as far as employment, types of employment, income, reliance on SSI, all those types of things. And presently, I have an estate planning website for family members who have someone with a disability. It's called specialneedstrustsonline.com. And that has tools for families doing family planning. And the difference between that and another online program is they actually get to work with me live while they do all the work. And I think initially I thought they wouldn't do that, but that seems to be the only way it works. So I work live with everybody who comes on, and we discuss what they need.
That's fantastic. Wow. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. What were you?
And that's about what I've been up to and why I'm involved in this. So I've been involved in it for a long time, and I've really engaged. Just for my son's doing awesome. He lives in his own apartment. He takes care of all his needs. He does have a support person that comes in a few days a week, and he goes to a day program a couple days a week. So, and he's really enjoying life, which is, I think, the biggest part of what we try to do for our children and for people with Down syndrome, to make sure that they have the same opportunities as everybody else.
I agree. Wow. Yeah, that is impressive. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us on the podcast today, because you've certainly done a lot in this area. And I guess where I'd like to start, I remember when my brother was 18, and then the school system said he can go another 3 years, and that's it. After that, he has to get a job. There's no other options. And this was, of course, back in the early 90s when he was graduating from high school. So I guess my question for you, because I know it's a question that a lot of our listeners may have, is there really college options for people with Down syndrome, like post-secondary options that some of our families may not even be aware of that? So how would you answer that question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There are programs. There's programs all across the country now. And it's something that every family should consider, and every individual with Down syndrome should consider. It makes a big difference in their lives. It gives them opportunity that they didn't have. And I'll talk about your brother's experience, which is typically what was happening, and still what happens, obviously, because a lot of folks don't know about these programs, is especially when you have a student with Down syndrome who's been included in regular classes all along. So what happens is that student went through high school, 4 years of high school with their peers, and their peers who probably they've been in school with since kindergarten, and a good percentage of them are going to college. What we find is that students who have been included start to say, well, why not me? Why aren't I going to college? What are my opportunities? But the challenge for the school district is when they don't take advantage of that is they now have this student for another 3 or 4 years before they age out of special education. And the challenge for them is, what do I do with this student? They can't keep them in high school for another 4 years. We all know our high school experience in another 4 years would have been torturous for us. So it's the same for someone with Down syndrome. So it's something that really should be considered. And there's a lot of resources out there to look at and to examine. And even if they just Google now, Google college for individuals with Down syndrome or intellectual disabilities, they'll find lots of information. They just have to know that it's there, I guess, is the biggest step.
And I'm sure you'll be able to share some links and things like that with me, which I can put in the show notes for folks to be able to find this. But what does a college program look like for someone with Down syndrome? Like for somebody walking onto a college campus, if they were to walk behind somebody with Down syndrome, what would their kind of day look like on a college campus?
It would look almost like everybody else's day on a college campus. That's the reality, and that's the goal, right? We want them to have complete access to everything everybody else does on the college campus. Typically, they'll attend just regular classes. The biggest difference, I think, is that typically someone with an intellectual disability is going to take only 1 or 2 classes a semester, right? Because it's a pretty demanding piece, and if you have an intellectual disability, it's super demanding. Typically, the class or the assignments to that student would be somewhat modified. The student typically would work with disability services, who services everybody else on the campus. I've seen some models where the student with the intellectual disability would go to disability services, get a pre-teach of what's going to happen in the class, then go to class, and then go to the disability services after to help them with assignments and those types of things. So they're getting lots of support. There's also, typically they'll have someone like a coach or someone else, a coach for the person with Down syndrome, to help them navigate the campus, at least initially. The other aspect, in like a lot of colleges are actually now, these students would live on campus. They would live in the dorms with everybody else. In Massachusetts, we did that in our public program. And initially there was a lot of angst about how do we do this? What do we do? And they found out that there really wasn't an issue at all. That it works pretty seamlessly. Obviously the RAs knew and everybody was on board and well trained to handle this, but the students lived independently in the dorms, and that's part of the experience. And I'll get on a soapbox for a little bit. So the challenge we have when we look at people with intellectual disabilities or Down syndrome to be successful in life, the biggest challenge is we need to prepare them for that. And if you look at how everybody else is prepared, they go through, school, they go to classes, they take the bus, they do extracurricular activities, they go on to college, the same thing. If we deny people with Down syndrome those basic rights, they're going to be essentially behind the 8 ball in this process. The challenge that I see frequently is, oh, they're not ready. And I'm sure you've heard that before, and your listeners have. Yeah. Your child or your student is not ready for this. We need to prepare them for this. The challenge is you spend all your time preparing and you never get to play the game. So you really need to get out there and do this. So, and that's part of what's happening in these programs, is to make sure that these students are included. And I'll share a little anecdote, if you will.
Sure.
That happened in Massachusetts. I was very involved with the implementation in Massachusetts. We had one of the professors at one of our state universities. She was a professor of special education. She did not want a student, a student with an intellectual disability in her classroom.
Wow.
And then finally, when they were looking for professors that wanted to take part in this new program, she finally decided, well, I'll do it, but this will just prove that it's not appropriate for these students. So she came in, first class. She started teaching the class. It was, I guess, more of a lecture format. The student with an intellectual disability raised his hands and said, hold on. He goes, I don't know anybody in this class. Can we introduce ourselves? So they went around the room and they introduced themselves, which was different.
Yeah.
And then they continued on. The class that this student was taking was actually special education law. And throughout the class, there was this sort of interest and excitement, and the class came together in a way she'd been teaching for like 30 years and never had this kind of experience. Wow. She also talked about another student who was in the class who was really just not engaged, who would come to class in his pajamas. I guess that's a thing. But the student started to engage with the student with an intellectual disability. And as time went on, she saw that that student really stepped up his game and became very engaged in the class as well. But overall, she said that that was the best class that she had taught in about her 30 years of being a college professor.
Wow.
So
it sounds like kind of what we know from inclusive education research in younger ages, in the elementary and middle school kind of areas, how beneficial that is, not only for the person with an intellectual disability, but for the people around them. It sounds like from these stories that the same kind of thing is probably happening on college campuses as well. Would you agree?
Go figure. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's it really doesn't take a lot of thought to think, oh yeah, that would really be good for all people, right? For everybody engaged, including the professor.
Yes, for sure. And so I guess my question would be, so all of these students very likely had some sort of IEP or something like that in their high school training. And what you're saying is with these college programs, most, if not all, of the colleges would have some sort of support services in place for this person to be able to succeed in the classroom. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but they have that for all students with disabilities. Sure. It's not just students with Down syndrome or intellectual disabilities. It's for all students, and that's part of the inclusive nature, right? They're just taking advantage of the services that are already there.
Yeah.
So they would have those support services. And I think the lesson for your listeners to take away is they may be sitting there now thinking, oh, that's great, but that must be just for those super high achieving students with Down syndrome. Sure. That this isn't for my kid, because my kid really doesn't have those types of abilities. That's absolutely incorrect. This is for everyone. So you really want to give them the opportunity that everybody else has, and they should think about it. There's one more point that I forgot to make.
Sure.
And there's research that where I was before, the research shows that parents should be talking about college from the time the kid is in kindergarten. This is not kid turns 18 years old. Let's think about college. The parents should be thinking about it with their child all the way through this kid's school program, as well as with their special education teachers and say, the goal is for my child to go to college. Obviously, when you show up at the IEP meeting and with a kindergarten and say, my goal is to go to college, the special education department may be saying, well, that parent's in denial.
Yeah. Yeah,
but
and it's all about advocating.
Not in denial.
Yes, right, and advocating for your child right from the beginning, letting the educators know that you're not looking for shortcuts. You're looking for your child to succeed, just like you would for any other child. I love that. If you had to guess, like, is this a situation where when a family is looking into these college options, that there are specific colleges that they should be looking at? Or are you saying that this is something that every college in the country should be offering at this point? How would you answer that question?
Um, my answer is that every college in the country should be offering this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm even, yeah, I'm even wondering if there's a legal argument for that. We're seeing this really grow quickly and exponentially now. The first programs really began in the 70s, but the concept, the way I've described it, began about 20 years ago. And we're seeing that growth now. Because I just pulled the number. One of the questions which is coming up, which you're going to ask me, is how many of these programs
That's
are there in
right.
the
I
country?
am.
Yeah. So there's 308 in the country, and about a few years ago there was only 200. So we're seeing a very rapid growth in these programs. So they're all around the country. Typically, though, a student with Down syndrome would go to a college that already has this in place.
Okay.
I think we all know to be the pioneer is very tough, and that happens. But there are at least 308 now established programs in every state in the country, with the exception of Wyoming. And folks are working on Wyoming to make sure that they have a program there. So you should be able to find a program in your own state that has that. And you'll have the link. The link is to thinkcollege.net. That's the National Coordinating Center that I had mentioned before. Okay. But with that in the links, once people go there, they'll see all sorts of information about college programs and what they have to offer.
I mean, this is just amazing. I'm thinking about the families that I meet, when their babies are just born, infants. And, we talk about how things are different now compared to even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And one of the areas that we certainly will address is education in general has grown so dramatically. The options have grown so dramatically for people with Down syndrome just in these last, 10, 15 years even. And so now that we know that there are these college programs available, that the lid has been taken off on terms of where people will put limits on people with Down syndrome and getting educated, what do you think are the benefits for somebody to pursue a college education? I know we know what that might be for in a typical population, but what would be some benefits for somebody with Down syndrome? What have you seen?
Well, I think what you see for the typical population is exactly the same for someone with Down syndrome, right? They have increased employment opportunities, they have increased financial security, they have increased knowledge about their community and actually have more community involvement. They have less reliance on government benefits. They're more likely to be employed. And for someone with Down syndrome, they see much greater independence and much greater self-advocacy skills moving forward. So it's really the same benefit that everybody else gets. Yeah. I think that's the lesson is that that's what happens. This is where my research and my dissertation comes through. It was there was no difference between a student with an intellectual disability and a typical student in the outcomes that we were seeing. Mm-hmm. My research was focused on mainly financial aspects and work aspects, but other research actually shows the same broad benefit for someone with an intellectual disability.
That's really amazing. And it's so encouraging as we're talking, just to think about how many opportunities open up now for people with Down syndrome after getting a college education, how much things can change. I guess with your expertise, with everything that you've researched and looked into, and with your background, what would you recommend in order for families to start to see more options, even as 10, 15 years from now, more options for post-secondary education for people with Down syndrome? What do you envision, I guess, happening in the next decade or two?
Well, one of the things is what's happening here in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have a pending bill that would essentially open the doors in all our colleges and universities to our public colleges and universities to individuals with intellectual disabilities. At this point, it's through a special grant program, so that's a little more restrictive. But I think that we need to give this opportunity to everyone in every college. And the benefits are what we described, not only for the student, but for the rest of the students and the faculty and the administration, and for society as a whole, right? If you look at one, and for us looking at it was initially is, well, what's the cost? The challenge with the cost is, if you have someone with an intellectual disability who then qualifies for SSI at the age of 18, the Social Security Administration then has to, on their books, reserve $280,000 for that person's lifetime. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And whatever you can do so that you get the $280,000 from the federal government, you would also have money that's supported from your state, whatever it's called, that supports individuals with intellectual disabilities, which is another huge number. You have all sorts of other government benefits and programs. Once you start chipping away at that, that makes a huge difference. So that the cost of not including students with Down syndrome in college is really pretty significant. Yeah. Much more significant than the cost of including them.
That's such an interesting perspective. I mean, yeah, I think from, when we think about how governments will look at the dollars and cents of things, it certainly would make sense, as you're describing, that inclusive education into a college and giving more college opportunities would be a huge change from their perspective as well. That way, even just looking at bottom line kind of figures. Is that, am I getting that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's just where you spend the money. In Massachusetts, we were stuck in this hole of how expensive it is. One of the challenges too, even when you look at special education, when we talked before about students when they turn 18 and don't go to college, the cost of including that student or not including the cost of educating that student until they're 22 can be pretty significant. What we're seeing in Massachusetts is actually, if that student goes to college, it is much, much cheaper dollars-wise than the program that would be offered by the local school district. So it's much cheaper to send the student to college, to give them that much more well-rounded experience than it is to keep the student essentially stuck in the resource room in high school.
This is so amazing, and I love this. I love your perspective. I love how you've been a strong advocate for offering more college programs over the years. I feel like we've talked about a lot of these topics in pretty good detail. Is there anything that you would want to make sure that our families get, or a summary that you would want our families to know before we close this podcast today?
I think you need to talk to your child who has Down syndrome. You need to talk to their teachers and the special education administrators and teachers to make sure that this opportunity is available to your child. Yeah. That it really it makes a huge difference in someone's enjoyment of life. That's the other thing I guess I left out, which is typical, is that the students that attend college end up to be actually happier. There's research that says that they're actually happier. So it would be the same for a student with Down syndrome who has college. So it's never too early to think about college. And when people tell you no, or you're in denial, don't listen to them. Listen to yourself. Yeah. And think of the opportunities for your child or for yourself if you have Down syndrome.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining the podcast, for sharing your expertise with all of us today. It's just been a real pleasure to learn more about these options that are out there. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. And for our listeners, I would just encourage you to take some of these things to heart. We will have the links in the show notes that we had talked about during the podcast today. Take a look at those things as well. And if you have other topics that you would like us to discuss on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out to Down Syndrome Center at chp.edu. We're glad to entertain any topics that you would like us to find expert guests on, like today with Tom. And Also, if you'd like to partner with what we are doing at the center, please do go to www.givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center, and you can join and partner with what we are doing here, including this podcast as well. But until next time, bye-bye.